Morning. It's lovely to be with you today, and I'm going to be reading first of all from the New Living Translation, Psalm 77. It reads like this: I cry out to God, yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for his help. You don't let me sleep. I am too distressed even to pray. I think of the good old days long since ended, when my nights were filled with joyful songs. I search my soul and ponder the difference now. Has the Lord rejected me forever? Will he never again be kind to me? Is his unfailing love gone forever? Have his promises permanently failed? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he slammed the door on his compassion? And I said, this is my fate. The Most High has turned his hand against me. But then I recall all you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They are constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. O God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your awesome power among the nations. By your strong arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the Red Sea saw you, O God, its waters looked and trembled. The sea quaked to its very depths. The clouds poured down rain. The thunder rumbled in the sky. Your arrows of lightning flashed. Your thunder roared from the whirlwind. The lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your road led through the sea, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway no one knew was there. You led your people along that road like a flock of sheep, with Moses and Aaron as their shepherds. A psalm that Israel used in their worship, recognizing their dependence on God, and also recognizing that, well, things didn't always work out quite as they expected. And in fact, sometimes God had to do something very unexpected. The key thought of this morning is brought into that verse 19 about the hidden road through a sea, a pathway through the waters, a pathway no one knew was there. We'll come back to that particular verse, but bear it in mind as we go through. This is a psalm that is a kind of lament. It begins with these verses that express the problems and the troubles the psalmist is finding. It spends time asking and looking at questions, and then it moves through into some reflection and eventually some hope, and then finishes on a note of praise. And we too need to spend time in that kind of lamenting, in the questions, and then in the praise. I think somebody ought to press the reboot button on 2020. How on earth do we get out of this mess? I find history fascinating. Perhaps it's old enough now that I remember too much of it. But it seems very clear that humanity gets into messes very, very easily. Getting out of them is a bit like being stuck in thick mud. You lift one foot and the other goes deeper. And if one foot comes out, as we step forward, the other foot comes right out of the welly. I sometimes wonder if at Glastonbury after the festival somebody has to go round on the following Tuesday digging up all the leftover wellies left in the mud. Well, the Bible has a habit of telling us to expect God to do things differently. Faith could be defined as the way of the unexpected. Now, to be honest, if we knew everything that God knew and could do everything God can do, we'd be God, and we're not. Faith involves the unexpected. Some years ago, excuse me while I scratch, I was driving into London on my way to a day's training, and the traffic was crawling. If you're used to commuting into South London, the bit in between the M25 and civilization is dreadful. We were crawling along, and I paused to let another car come out of a side road. What I didn't expect was that this guy would just shoot straight across both lanes of traffic and get sideswiped by somebody coming the other way. He hadn't looked. He just assumed because one driver was going to let him out that everything was clear. I don't know whether it was my fault or not, but by the time I was able to offer help to them, they'd finished shouting at each other and driven away. Sideswiped, and the whole day seemed suddenly different. Well, that describes 2020, and, well, what do we do about it? Shall we give up on society? We're in a right mess. Shall we wear masks or not wear masks? Can we have 5 people meeting, or 50, or 3, or what? Who knows what's coming next? Can't we just be a nice holy huddle? We can ignore all the others and, just look after ourselves and see how things go. I don't think that's an option. We could give up on church. We're meeting online. Well, that's nice in some ways, but it's not quite so personal, is it? It's not quite the same. But it's good we can, but not everybody can. Should we just give up altogether? Or just criticise everybody else and, think it's their fault and, we're all right, Jack? It's always easier to criticise than it is to help to build people up. I don't think giving up on church is the right answer. In fact, if the church gives up on faith and looking for God, I think this nation, this world are going to be in even deeper trouble than ever before. Shall we give up on God? It's an option. Have you ever been tempted? When it all seems just a bit too much and the answers aren't there, what do we do? Years and years ago, I came to Hotton Park as a mere youth with the family, and we went on the boating lake. In those days it had boats on it. It was great fun. It's a shame we haven't got them anymore, but maybe one day. There is an old joke, excuse the long-winded way of getting to the joke. On a boating lake, the guy is standing at the side and looking over the lake, and he's calling in people when their 20 minutes is up. And one boat is overdue, and he calls out, "Number 99, your time is up. Come in, number 99. And his wife looked at him and said, "We don't have a number 99. "Oh, number 66, are you in trouble?" I'm not sure it was worth telling the joke, but a cry for help is something that is part of faith. A situation that is suddenly hopeless, helpless, a disaster. Somebody somewhere ought to be able to help. As we look at the psalm together, the first couple of verses, they describe somebody who's engaged in a passionate pleading prayer, and it doesn't work out. It doesn't seem to be any kind of answer. In fact, in verse 3, it's reaching that conclusion. I'm moaning, I'm overwhelmed, my prayer hasn't been heard. And I wonder how many of us have felt like that at some point this year. As we move on to verse 4, things are, if anything, sounding more desperate. But we're entering a place where you could say we're looking at or singing the songs in the darkness. He sings to himself, he thinks to himself, shall I give up? I've got no sleep, no prayer. It's all distress and trouble and grief. And then in verse 5 and 6, he remembers the happy songs, the joyful music, the things that worked in the past. And music, of course, is something which is very powerful, very emotive. And most of us will have a favourite hymn or a song or a piece of music that always somehow sort of catches at us. And one of those for me, a piece of mood music, something I play if I'm feeling very thoughtful. It's Barber's Adagio on strings. And it's a lovely piece of music, but there is a kind of haunting quality to it. There's a sort of lament, a loneliness in it. And I actually stopped playing it at one point because I thought, this is just making me miserable. It's making me feel worse. And so I put something else on, something up-tempo and lively and full of hope. What mood music are we playing and listening to? If we think about music in church, well, we've been used for years to singing in worship, and now we can't. And even when we get back to normal and get back into our church building, even then our worship may well be different. Will we be able to sing, or will singing be different or sidelined? Maybe we've made too much of singing as part of our worship. Maybe it's time to explore some other avenues as well. I'm really grateful that we have a group of musicians in the church who've been recording things for us over lockdown, and they've done a brilliant job, and some of those songs have been absolutely beautiful and helpful to listen to. I'm really grateful to them. But I miss singing with my brothers and sisters. I miss being part of a group, sharing that worship together. I worry about our musicians a bit, whether they're feeling a kind of loss or grief. They've dedicated themselves to play on Sundays for us, and now they can't, and we aren't there. And it must be very, very difficult for them. Please pray for them and thank them for what they do and encourage them, because there are things that they can't do, would like to. So then what do we do when the songs don't work, society's in a mess and the church isn't perfect, and God, it seems, is only taking messages on the answer phone? Well, we must remember. The questions in verses 7 to 9 say the unthinkable. Has God left the building? If we're rejected, if we're unloved, has God changed? Verse 10, it gets worse. It's almost to say, well, we're done for. God has turned against us. Isn't that the logical conclusion for the situation we're in? And then in verse 11, thankfully, oh no, he hasn't. Please pardon the pantomime response. It's a kind of automatic thing. But it, I hope, makes the point. In that panto setting, is he, isn't he, shall he, shan't he? And this psalm comes in with this cry, no, God hasn't. He hasn't forgotten us. He hasn't condemned us. He hasn't abandoned us. But the painful questions still have to be faced and asked. And there's no guarantee of answers. The book of Job may not be one you turn to regularly for light reading, but it's very educational and actually very helpful, because in that book a man goes through situations in life that have no earthly explanation, and God doesn't answer the questions. He poses more questions, and then he blesses Job, and Job's faith, restored and renewed, continues. But it's an unsettling sort of book. We don't really like them when they're written that way. And it's the same with some of the other wisdom literature, like the Psalms and the Proverbs. These writings, they help us to see that faith is more than a formula. Whatever it is we know or think we know, sometimes we need to go beyond that, to go further in, to discover more. So then, what is it that we must remember? Well, firstly, what God has done in the past. And that is set out for us in the psalm. Secondly, what God has shown us about his nature and his character. That we can always depend on. And then we must remember God has unexpected ways of doing things. Verses 12 to 15. What happened in the past tells us what God is like now, in the present, and also tells us what we can confidently look forward to in what often seems to be a hidden and uncertain future. Now, as a football fan and a supporter of the one true Albion, sorry Nick, but that's it really, it's really been a strange season, the weirdest in living memory. And back in March, everything seemed to be totally black. Would the season even be finished? What would happen? Who'd be relegated? Who'd be the winners? Oh. But now we've reached a point where Brighton are safe again for another year. There is an Albion in the Premier League. In fact, next year there'll be two, but only one is the real one. Just remember that, Nick. Well, miracles still happen. The fact that Brighton have been in the Premier League for 3 years and are still there for a fourth, many people would say is a miracle. We worship a God who does much bigger and better miracles than football. So anyway, back to the text. The dramatic, poetic effect we get when we read verses 16 to 18, it really makes me want to stand up and do a round of applause. It's so dramatic, it makes everything come alive and sort of really builds an impact that makes you want to go, wow, this is the storm of all storms and God is at work here. It's, if you like, the special effects department of heaven in full blast. Special effects, there's a thing. A few years ago we had the privilege of going to America and we visited Universal Studios and we went to see some of their special effects departments. What they had done and they'd constructed to show how they work in the films, and it was amazing. It was almost completely, totally convincing, and yet at the same time you knew it was somebody pressing buttons and doing things behind the scenes and carefully preparing things, and the effect was magnificent. But it was all done because there was a mastermind directing the story. It's not just random events, it's not just things that happen because they happen for a reason, they happen for a purpose. God is directing the story of his people and the story of this world. And sometimes the special effects are pretty brilliant. Welcome to verse 19. Looking back and remembering and discovering that God always had a pathway. It was a hidden pathway, an unexpected way. They were to go through the Red Sea. Nobody knew beforehand, and it took everyone by surprise. Now, there have been those who said, well, it wasn't really the Red Sea that was parted, they just went through the marshes. And there's a story of a young child in school who, when told that by the teacher, said, well then, miss, the miracle is that all the Egyptians drowned in 6 inches of water. However we look at it, this is a miracle. God delivers his people. And as the psalm writer looks back from his time of trouble, he looks back to when God did something great and marvellous and fantastic. And he says, we didn't know, but you were still in charge. There was a pathway through the waters. an unknown way. This verse was quite important for me a few years ago. When we were ministering down in Devon, the church was going through a lot of changes. We'd been a multiple congregation church for several years, and now it was time to see how things should go forward. And we were all scratching our heads, and if you've ever had the joy of looking at legal documents, you look at a constitution, then you look at charity law, and you think, how on earth can we do this? We know what we want to try and do, but how? And one of the elders in the church, a lovely man of God who was really, really deeply respected by everyone, he came to us one week at a meeting and he said, well, I don't really understand this, but I just have this sense that God is putting this verse to us now. This verse 19, your road led through the sea, your pathway through the mighty waters, a pathway no one knew was there. From that point onwards, the task of uncombining the congregations, letting them loose to see what God was going to be doing in each different community, it became much more straightforward. It was still hard work, it was still quite difficult, but there was a sense that God was actually guiding us and providing a way for us, an unexpected way that would emerge for us. Thankfully, he did, and that became a good ending for a chapter and opened up new chapters of opportunity and ministry. God can do amazing things. Well, what about ourselves and this psalm? It's all right for me to sit here and say, you know, God does things unexpectedly. Well, some of us actually quite like to have things laid out nicely and planned in advance. We find it difficult to react to the kind of spontaneous miracle. Well, sorry, God does that sometimes. What we have to do, though, is recognise we don't have all the answers, and even recognise we don't understand the questions. I remember at school, back when Noah was a lad, the English teacher was explaining how not to answer questions in the English exams for O-level. And he talked about a pupil of his in the past who had written an absolutely wonderful essay about a parrot. Unfortunately, the parrot didn't come into the question at all, and everything he'd written, as eloquent as it was a waste of time and space and very good words. We need to know the questions, understand them, before we know the answers. And we need to be prepared to be surprised. I cannot pretend I understand or can foretell how things will change in Britain over the next couple of years, what will happen to our churches, to the way society operates. These things we don't know, we don't understand. We're all guessing and stumbling in the dark. But God is greater than our problems. Be prepared to be surprised. Sometimes I've come across people who say things like this: we've never done it that way before. Well, actually, that's not something to be proud of. Maybe it's time to do something different, something new, especially for us as Christians, as churches. God may have a new, unexpected plan, and as we begin to move towards it, who knows what we'll find. God is greater than our weakness. In fact, our weaknesses reveal how great, how powerful God really is. A New Testament example, very quickly, the feeding of the 5,000. What does God do when his children are weak? Well, this is what happened, remember? Jesus said, you feed them. And they said, huh? Us? And eventually the boy comes forward, the bread and the fishes, and Jesus has faith and he prays and he starts to dish the stuff out. Because when the disciples didn't pray, Jesus did. When the disciples didn't see God, he sought his Father. When the disciples were weak, Jesus was strong. And when the disciples had no faith, he had faith and he thanked God. Wonderfully powerful words, those, thanking God, even at the beginning of our need of a miracle. But what happened next as he divides it and gives it out? There was loads left over. Isn't it wonderful though? He doesn't use that as a lesson to say, look you lot, you thickos, this is what you should have done. No, Jesus uses them. Rather than punishing them, he makes use of them. He gives them something to do. There they are, giving out bread they didn't ask for, enjoying the answer to a prayer they hadn't prayed. And if Jesus had acted just on the faith of his disciples, how many of the crowd would go home hungry? But he didn't, and he doesn't. God is true to us, even if we're tempted to forget him. So we don't give up. We look up, we trust, we believe. And it's not an empty, hollow optimism, because God has proven worthy. Jesus has shown himself to be an even greater saviour than what happened at the Red Sea. The cross, there the tide of the universe was parted and the people were able to walk through the way of the cross, the unexpected way. No one had seemed to even imagine, but God had it planned. God is worthy of our trust. He doesn't fail, even though we sometimes think the only thing we have is failure. God is faithful even when we find it hard to be faithful, and that's what makes God God. When it mattered, like for Israel at the Red Sea, there is a pathway through the waters. Well, it's time to bring it to an end. I'd just like to ask a couple of simple things. What is your lament about in your faith at the moment? What are you struggling with and grieving over? It's not wrong to be grieving and struggling. But what are the worries and the stresses you're facing? Be real about it. Admitting it and accepting that it's real is important, because then we can move on to the point where we can believe that God has an unexpected pathway forward for us. Verse 20 finishes the psalm, and it seems a very nice, tidy ending. God led the people on that pathway and sent Moses and Aaron with them to be their shepherds. God provided the way, he provided the opportunity, he even provided the companions to walk in faith together. I wonder what pathways God will lead us on from here forwards. Don't do a Corporal Jones. Don't panic. Don't panic. God was and is to come. We can trust in who he is and what he is like, the power that he has, and his ability to find the unexpected pathways to do something truly wonderful. Lord, lead me, lead us on your pathway. Let's pray together. Father, in reading this psalm, we've recognized that faith has problems as well as joys. We recognize that we have questions, and what we want to say together, Lord, is this: we will trust you, and we know you will make a pathway, and we will be blessed as we serve you and walk in your way. Lord, receive our prayers and our love in Jesus' name. Amen.